At a Queen's School talent show in 1953, two lads crossed paths. Their peak popularity as a musical duo occurred in 1970. One then made an inexcusable statement: "I don't care about music or money." For the following 10 years, they performed flawless harmony on stage while remaining silent behind the scenes. One of them covertly recorded 30 songs by themselves without the other knowing. Without asking, the other one deleted the voices. Both of them published derogatory terms about the other in 2015. For the next 9 years, they would remain silent. This is how people who were pals as kids turned into fierce rivals. Paul Simon came into this world in Newark, New Jersey on October 13, 1941. He was born to Jewish parents from Hungary. Belle was his elementary school teacher mother. His dad, Louis, was a double agent. He taught college courses during the day. At night, he would perform as Lee Sims, the bassist for various dance bands. They had a lot of music and books in their home. Structural regularity and rhythm were integral parts of Paul's upbringing. Eleanor escorted him to the synagogue. He was escorted to Yankee Stadium by Louis. It was much more than just baseball when you watched Joe Diageo and Mickey Mantle. Heroes were the subject. Paul would pen Diageo into Mrs. Robinson many years down the road. Paul was the archetypal New York Jewish youngster, one who liked music and baseball, the two things that often made immigrants feel like they belonged. The family relocated to a neighborhood called Kew Gardens Hills in Queens in 1945, when Paul was just 4 years old. Donald Fagen recalled before. Everything shifted after that transfer. It was more than simply a house. The world was different. As a family, they would stay up late to watch Louis's performances on shows like Arthur Godfrey and Friends and the Jackie Gleason Show. Suddenly, Paul witnessed his father transition from a teacher to a performer. It made its imprint. He understood that music was more than just noise. Who I was, how I performed, and professional life. The Queens area was teeming with Jewish families that placed a premium on education and music. Every sound was absorbed by Paul. He stumbled into Lead Belly's grimy folk blues, jazz, and Woody Guthrie. His worldview was profoundly affected by all of it. He quickly discovered a schoolmate who would become his musical hero. Paul was 11 years old in 1953. At the public school 164 talent event, he witnessed Art Garfunkel, a young man his own age, performing alone. Some girls were gushing over him in whispers. I knew it then. Not only was Paul enamored with singing, but he also became obsessed with the idea of using singing to win over people, particularly girls. Later that year, for their 6th grade graduation production of Alice in Wonderland, the two crossed paths again. The experience seemed insignificant, yet it was the beginning of a remarkable musical career for them. It seemed as if they were born to sing in harmony. Pepton was their doo-wop group name, and they played at neighborhood parties and school dances. A musical career began for Paul. He wrote their first original song while he was just 13 years old. They had evolved into more than simply peers by the time they were 15. As musicians, they had albums out. Their love of the Everly Brothers served as inspiration for the 1957 single, Hey Schoolgirl, which they recorded under the pseudonyms Tom and Jerry. They were attempting to recall the words to Hey Doll Baby when they accidentally composed it. A demo was recorded using the $25 they managed to scrounge together. For children in 1957, that was a lot, but it served its purpose. Upon hearing these, promoter Sid Prowan put his signature on them. Suddenly, Paul was Jerry Landis. Art morphed into Tom Graff. On Billboard's charts, the song peaked at number 49. Its sales surpassed 100,000 units. American Bandstand even included them. Even at the tender age of 15, They had achieved literary fame. On the other hand, problems were simmering under the radar. Paul was already busy at that point, not just singing. The Girl for Me, their debut single, was penned by him when he was barely 12 or 13 years old. His dad even penned the chord charts and lyrics, which are now housed in the Library of Congress. Art sounded more natural. Both the pen and ambition were in Paul's hands. Because of such disparity, Paul's artistic and performing endeavors suffered from at the outset, and things would swiftly deteriorate. Paul led a clandestine musical life from 1957 till 1964. He recorded more than 30 songs under aliases while he was still working with Art, True Taylor, Jerry Landis, and Paul Kane. Aside from Madison, he was also associated with Big Amy, Hunt, King, and Tribute. This was more than a pastime. In silence, Paul was constructing, without Art's knowledge or consent. It wasn't only his own songs that he was recording. Other people hired him to write and produce their work. He had been producing music for artists like Richie Cordell, Doy Daniels, and the Vebbles since 1962, when he joined Amy Records. In 1958, he released his debut solo song under the name True Taylor. Just a few short months after Hey School became a smash hit, he began plotting his own professional future. When Sid Prosen approached Paul privately, offering him solo agreements without informing Art, that's when the damage really started to pile up. Paul chose not to bring it up. When Art learned about it later, it devastated him. The infidelity, he stated afterwards, broke their friendship. It was something he could never forgive. Even though Art had faith in their partnership, Paul was making preparations to flee. It was particularly painful because Tom and Jerry were having trouble replicating their initial hit. Paul wasted no time. He proceeded. By the time Art understood what was going on, it was already too late. Things became worse when Paul achieved success apart from Art. Paul had a moderate success in 1962 with Motorcycle, which he performed with a new band called Tycho and the Triumphs. On the Billboard charts, it peaked at number 99. Meanwhile, under Jerry Landis's direction, he debuted the Lone Teen Ranger. It reached position number 97 on the charts. Even if they were little victories, Paul demonstrated that he could achieve success without Art. Although another singer by the name of Marty Cooper was the frontman for the Tycho and the Triumphs group, Paul's cold logic was on display. On the hit single, Paul sung lead. Behind the scenes, he was coordinating everything while maintaining his own persona. This bolstered Paul's prior convictions. On his own, he may succeed. His prior betrayal seemed even more calculated in light of that. By no means was he merely venturing out. He had secretly taken Art's place. They broke up in 1958. Back then, it didn't amount to much. The damage was deep, yet they just drifted. After a gap of 5 years, they finally got back together in 1963. Paul published about 30 tracks under several aliases during the period. Even Art attempted to compose music. But he didn't accomplish much without Paul's connections and motivation. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel missed one other too much to reunite in 1963. The situation was critical. Paul had just about managed to stay alive by 1963. He was responsible for making cold calls to record labels on behalf of a music publisher. He Was My Brother, one of his compositions, got the ear of Tom Wilson, a producer at Columbia Records. Paul was unwanted by Wilson. He was hoping a British group could use the tune. Thus, Paul took a daring step. He persuaded Wilson to let Art and him try out for a studio audition. The Sound of Silence was their song. After collaborating with jazz greats like Miles Davis, Wilson was taken aback. His favorite parts were Art's crystal-clear voice and Paul's heartfelt lyrics. A real contract was secured after that single audition. Their true identities were revealed for the very first time. However, their difficulties were only getting started. Wednesday morning, 3 a.m. was their first studio album. Failed miserably. Just 1,000 copies were sold in the 8 months after its release in October 1964. The folk sound that they relied on became stale all of a sudden. Everything had altered because of the Beatles. At the most inopportune moment, Columbia attempted to promote them as an element of folklore. Poor evaluations were made. Revenue was down. They broke up once more. Far over in England, Paul bolted. In minor clubs he played. There he even recorded the Paul Simon Song Book, his solo CD. Although everything was happening, Art remained in New York and resumed his studies at Columbia. Their future blockbusters would include songs that Paul composed while he was in this solitary exile, but they were unaware of this at the time. Afterwards, an absurd event transpired. While they weren't looking, producer Tom Wilson secretly added electric guitars and drums to The Sound of Silence in 1965. Following Bob Dylan's sessions for Like a Rolling Stone, he accomplished this. He proceeded without seeking approval. His silence spoke volumes. Everything was okay after he let go of it. Boston and Florida radio stations began playing the remixed version. Reading Billboard magazine during his performance in Denmark, Simon discovered the most outrageous manner. On January 1, 1966, the song became the #1 hit. Paul was taken aback. Even though Art wanted to celebrate, Paul was taken aback by the remix. The shifts in tempo were horrible to him. But people loved it nevertheless. They quickly reunited to record an album in order to capitalize on the craze. But now things were different. In 1966, Paul desired complete authority. He dominated the session as he recorded Thyme, Rosemary, Parsley, and Sage. The instruments were under his control. The volume was under his control. It was a studio resident for months. While he was in England, he wrote a lot of songs. The main reason Garfunkel was there was to sing. It was that. The album was an enormous hit. Millions of copies were sold, and it peaked at number 4 on the Billboard list. However, Paul began to believe that he was the mastermind behind everything. All Art did was provide the voice. The disparity would worsen over time. Even worse. The Graduate followed. Their score was included in the 1967 film directed by Mike Nichols. It catapulted them into the public eye. Despite the fact that Mrs. Robinson was unfinished when the picture was released, it became an enormous hit. The album's score reached the top spot. When their subsequent studio album, Bookends, propelled them to a 16-week chart-topping run. They took home the Grammy for Record of the Year. Unfortunately, there were also fissures while we were successful. Paul thought Art was being praised too much. The audience thought Art had composed the music. Even though Paul wrote the piece, the credit for it went to Art. The manager summed it up well. One of them was envious of the other. Problematically, Paul lacked confidence. Art was more photogenic and towering than Paul, and the time Art made the quip, "I'll always be taller than you," that hurt for decades. And then the last strike. Their role in Catch-22 was requested by Mike Nichols. Even though they were both cast, Paul's role was cut. The movie ended with just artwork. Devastated was Paul. In order to film the film, Art departed for Mexico. Paul remained in the Big Apple. Everything was shattered by that split. Paul was hoping that they will continue to compose music. On the contrary, Art departed for months. A whole year slipped away from what ought to have been 6 weeks. Bridge Over Troubled Water, their album, took 2 lengthy sessions to record. A single one in November 1968, and a second one in January 1969. Paul did nothing while waiting and stewing. After Woodstock, it was over. The performance was a bust. Art continued to film. Paul kept at it, but something was always off. They had always relied on immediate criticism to shape their creative process. In the same room, two voices. Paul should transmit tapes to Mexico, Art wanted. Changes would be communicated by Art in a subsequent phone conversation. According to him, the section was terrible. It was as if Paul were an entry-level worker. That was humiliating. This was always going to end up being. Similar to this, Art then made a statement that put a stop to it all. When he told Paul, "Here's how it'll be. I'll make movies for 6 months, then come back, and you'll have written the songs, and we'll do the album." Paul's response was brief. No, that will not transpire. He wasn't only turning down an idea. He firmly opposed the notion of getting employed as a songwriter by someone. Paul had always done everything from writing songs to running the sessions to creating the sound. However, the audience was rooting for Art. When Art performed Bridge Over Troubled Water at a live performance, the audience went absolutely crazy. Paul would quietly stand by himself during the final sessions of Bridge Over Troubled Waters thinking, "That's my song, man." Water was solitary. Paul, the band, and the producer were all by themselves. Art had been to Mexico. The title track's instruments were even recorded in California to facilitate Art's travel. The day arrived, nevertheless, for Art to sing it alone, and he received standing ovations. Their final and most successful album was that one. After Paul Simon and Garfunkel broke up in 1970, many assumed that he would recover quickly. The song, Bridge Over Troubled Water, had just recently gone viral, spending 6 weeks at the top of the charts around the world. However, Paul felt fear in his heart. He took chances because he was afraid. Paul Simon was the name of his debut solo effort, which came out in January 1972. A dining item that sparked one of the songs, Mother and Child Reunion, was a chicken and egg dish. However, the sound was the true twist. In Kingston, Jamaica, Paul had joined Jimmy Cliff's band for a reggae recording session. The result was satisfactory. In the United States and the United Kingdom, the song peaked at number 5. Paul continued to demonstrate his ability to compose narrative-driven music with another single, Me and Julio Down by the Schoolyard, which peaked at number 22. Album sales peaked at number 4 in the US charts and number 1 in the UK and Japan as well. Paul released the single, There Goes Ryman Simon, in 1973. His self-assurance was rapidly increasing. He experimented with several styles and instruments. Kodachrome, a song about memory that cleverly used photography as a metaphor, peaked at number 2. After that, the Cashbox chart-topping Loves Me Like a Rock came out. Unusually, he enlisted the gospel quartet Dixie Hummingbirds to provide backing vocals. Though it failed to get at number 1, the song, American Tune, managed to strike a chord. It used a Bach melody and succinctly expressed the nation's grief over Vietnam in only a few verses. On Cashbox, that album peaked at number 1. After a long hiatus, Paul finally dropped Still Crazy in 1975, 2 years later. His most sinister piece to yet. Despite the song's heavy subject matter, he had recently divorced Peggy Harper. They were commercially successful. Paul was named Best Male Pop Vocalist. The album was named Album of the Year at the Grammys, and it reached number 1 on Billboard. Most popular song, 50 Ways to End a Love Relation. It topped the charts for 3 weeks in the beginning of 1976. My Little Town, a delightful surprise featuring Art Garfunkel, was also included on that album. That rose to the position of 9th. However, Paul's private life was anything from steady. Princess Leia's husband, Carrie Fisher, was wed to her in 1983. They had an incredibly fast-paced romance. They fell in love rapidly after meeting during the Star Wars frenzy, but it was a terrible decision for him to tie the knot while on his reunion tour with Garfunkel. Paul appears in a documentary set to be released in 2024. Turned around and said that being married was draining. It was Carrie's life in the limelight. True fame was something she grasped. Not Paul. Paul wasn't made to handle the media the way she did. Their brief 11-month marriage was memorable nonetheless. Their careers were soaring. It was Paul again, the center of attention. Hollywood continued to revolve around Carrie. Even Paul's best man, Lorne Michaels, described the wedding as a tempest. They were surrounded by fame at all times. It was Carr's universe that exhausted Paul, he said afterward. She loves the spotlight, has unstable moods, and struggles with addictions. It was overwhelming. He lamented that everything had become a media circus. A lot of Paul's music was influenced by that emotional turmoil. Hearts and Bones, his critically acclaimed 1983 album, bombed at the box office. Even though the songs were honest and heartfelt, the listeners didn't relate, at least not back then. In hindsight, it is evident that he was emotionally breaking down. Also, other issues arose as a result of the fame and fortune. They were married on private planes, staying in 5-star hotels, and being photographed nonstop. It was as if you were in a dream, according to Lorne Michaels. Paul, though, was more frightened by the prospect. In that realm, Carrie flourished. Not Paul. He felt as though he had to put on an act for the sake of his own survival. Changed Paul after they broke up. He wed Eddie Bickle in 1992, and they settled into a more peaceful existence together, raising 3 children. Following that, he avoided the tabloids. Paul, though, was far from done causing problems. He visited apartheid-era South Africa in 1985. Any kind of cultural interaction with the dictatorship was strictly forbidden by the UN. Nevertheless, Paul proceeded regardless. He recorded with local musicians in Soweto for 9 days. They labored in an environment of dread, police intimidation, and curfews. Their hourly wage was $200 from Paul, which was 3 times the going rate in New York. Everyone else made $15 a day. Activists were still enraged. Paul, according to Ghana's UN ambassador, bowed to. Existence alone constitutes apartheid. The reaction was swift. He was followed by protests in Birmingham and London. The musicians were against him. Picket lines followed Paul everywhere as he toured with Graceland. A new controversy ensued. One of them deals with thievery. Paul was accused by Steve Berlin of Los Lobos of stealing their music. Paul reportedly asked them to jam during the Graceland recordings despite his complete lack of preparation, according to Berlin. Indeed, they were. Paul eventually included that song on the album, but he neglected to give proper credit. Berlin stated that Paul merely said, "Sue me. See what happens," in response to their complaint. Paul vehemently disagreed. But according to Los Luz, they received 0. "I am not receiving credit. No compensation, just quiet." Disputes over credit were increasingly common, particularly among African artists. Others felt taken advantage of, while some backed Paul. "So another white man has to find my music," remarked South African jazz great Jonas Gwangwa. Individuals. The reality was unpalatable. Many felt Simon still had too much power, despite the fact that he paid above market rates and promised royalties. Paul remained steadfast. According to him, the protest was in the music. For him, the importance of the partnership outweighed the need to pen politically charged songs. "I didn't ask permission from the ANC." The ANC, he claimed. That just made everything worse. Not only was he blacklisted by the ANC, but the UN as well. He was accused of violating international law and consequently barred from South Africa. The UN withdrew his name in 1987, but by then, the harm had already been done. When Paul returned to London, artists such as Jerry Dammers and Billy Bragg continued to resist, even after all these years had passed. In 1975, it all began with an unexpected encounter. After their nasty breakup in 1970, Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel rarely communicated with one another. But they ended up back in the same room again in a Los Angeles studio, this time recording with Harry Nilsson and John Lennon. Then it hit. Everything became much easier. For an instant, it was as if nothing had changed. They regrouped as a pair and decided to give it another go. Months were spent that year in the studio. They seemed fixated on returning to their glory days, on the enchantment that first brought them fame. Nevertheless, it was unsuccessful. Despite their best efforts, they could only perform My Little Town. Surprisingly, the song was included on each of their separate albums rather than a collaborative one. Their intention seemed to be to return, but they remained divided over the distribution of their sole musical composition. All that was to come after it was hinted at by it. After then, there was a peak. They were united at Central Park on September 19, 1981. 500,000 or more turned out. Every inch of the expansive lawn was occupied by the throng. Trees were scaled and rooftops were occupied, anything to get a good view. Quick look. The concert was monumental, not merely massive. HBO spent over $1 million to broadcast it. Platinum was the certification for the live album. They were able to gather $51,000 to get the dilapidated park fixed. Reissued records rose to the top once more. The world seemed to be yearning for their return. However, tensions were building behind the scenes. A 1982 world tour was the result of the success. Their spectacular comeback should have been that. However, it revealed how severely they disagreed. They ceased conversing. Not merely disagreements, but total quiet. Each night, after singing flawless harmony, they would gracefully exit the stage and proceed away from one another. They were clearly not even trying to act cordial. The melodies evoked a sense of oneness. The truth was icy. Before the tour, they attempted to remedy it. Transparent communication, commitments, and aspirations. The flaws, however, became more apparent when they entered the road. Not even sharing a car would be an option for them. Behind the scenes, it was a slow-motion collapse, but the audience watched the show. Things became much worse in 1983. Think Too Much, their first studio album since Bridge Over Troubled Water, was in the works. Several songs included vocals recorded by Garfunkel. It was going to be a full-length Simon and Garfunkel album, but Paul changed his mind. Without informing Garfunkel, he felt the songs were too intimate, particularly the one concerning his connection with Carrie Fisher. With Art's vocals removed, he re-recorded the entire piece and renamed it Hearts and Bones before releasing the solo. It crushed Garfunkel. After being there the entire time, shaping the songs and putting in the work, he was eventually cut. Erased without any prior notice or conversation. A betrayal, he said afterwards. After that, they decided to stop collaborating musically. There was a final opportunity in 2010. A tour to reunite the relatives was organized. Unfortunately, Garfunkel's unexpected voice cord paralysis prevented it from beginning in New Orleans. He was a terrible singer. There was a delay, and subsequently a cancellation of the tour. Simon was very hurt by that. Garfunkel hadn't been forthright about how terrible it was, in his opinion. Trust, which was already fragile, shattered. Despite Garfunkel's apologies to admirers, the harm had already been done. Simon still felt no motivation to go on, even after he had healed. Garfunkel retaliated in 2015. Garfunkel gave The Telegraph an incredibly harsh interview that May. He slammed Simon for walking and called him an idiot. After Bridge Over Troubled Water. His sympathies for Simon's little stature led to the beginning of their friendship in 1953, he added. The most devastating line followed. A monster was born out of that compensating gesture. Not only was it cruel, but it was also deeply hurtful and intimate. Is Simon suffering from a Napoleon complex? The interviewer wanted to know. The Gargoyle failed to be hesitant. In my opinion, yes. Yes. It was cruel to hear from someone you've known your whole life. My Paul is to me what your Paul is to you. The Paul sidelined us. It wasn't simply an insult, he said. George Harrison informed him once. Drawing parallels to another well-known dispute only served to inflame the situation more. It had been a few years since I wrote a new song, and I couldn't muster the same enthusiasm. The spark of inspiration they once shared has long since died out. From then on, they remained silent for almost 10 years. There was total quiet from 2015 through 2024. 0 emails, 0 phone calls. 2 long-lost pals, now in their twilight years, grow apart. The only thing that broke the awkward silence was when Garfunkel happened to run into Simon's son, Harper, in their apartment complex. It resulted in a lunch reunion. As Garfunkel probed more, "What happened? Why haven't we seen each other?" Simon responded understatedly, "An old interview. You said some stuff." In those peaceful years, Simon had his own challenges. His most intimate work to date, the 33-minute acoustic CD 7 Psalms, was released in 2023. Something more serious, though, was lurking behind that. His left ear was practically deaf. 6% were left. Even doctors were baffled. It followed a severe bout of COVID-19 in 2022, which had rendered him physically weakened as well. "You can call me Al anymore," was his confession when he said he couldn't sing. "That's gone," he declared. Not that one. What a devastating blow. He was a musician for all his life, but now he can't play an instrument. On CBS Mornings in November 2024, Simon discussed his emotions, describing them as anger, frustration, and a sense of being trapped in silence, both with himself and the one person who had witnessed his meteoric ascent to prominence. Emptiness accompanied by squandered opportunities, severed relationships, and a bond that had once revolutionized society. They were just 2 kids from Queens who wanted to sing on school mics and dream big. And they were there. However, at some point, their friendship deteriorated, they ceased performing musically, and the resulting quiet became more noticeable than any harmony they had previously achieved.